what if the purpose of this feature is not always to progress people? Because we tend to think about the user experience in this very clean linear path. They start at the upper funnel, land on the homepage, they do a search, they land on a PDP or a product page, and then hopefully they book and or check out and book. And the reality is it's very messy, and people do loop. So it's like, what if a feature doesn't always progress a user? What if it's actually makes them happier if you show them they're in the wrong place and get them regressed faster?
Welcome to Unite Voices, hosted by Katie Green. Real stories from the people behind today's most innovative experimentation programs. No fluff, just wins, failures, and the lessons in between.
Paul, welcome to Unite Voices, hosted by me, Katie Green. I always feel so silly saying that, but it is part of the song and dance. I'm really excited to have you on the show. You have incredible experience in experimentation. I'm really excited for the world to hear what you and I discussed previously and get to know you a little bit better. So why don't you get us started and tell the people who you are?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Paul Davidson. I was product manager on a internal experimentation platform for a few years, and part of that work had me both working not only on the platform features and the strategy and the roadmap and all that, but on the practitioner side as well. So working with our other product managers or analysts and engineers that were using the platform and trying to help them experiment better as well.
When you and I last spoke, you've mentioned that experimentation can become an anchor, something that teams have to do, but like aren't learning from necessarily. And I've personally seen that a ton where people have these really good experimentation engines, but they don't have the infrastructure to be learning at the same rate that they're experimenting. I'm curious to get some of your learnings on that because I know people in the community are probably going to listen to that and say, "Oh my gosh, that sounds like my experimentation program." Have you ever experienced that? And what is your insight there?
Yeah, I think the feeling of it becoming an anchor for us, it's something that happened over time and it was a drift that kind of happened. And it's kind of this series of factors that we'll be talking about where they're kind of designing experiments too complex. They were waiting way too late to validate it. And not really just setting the experiment up for a good outcome and success of its own. And so, like, what's happening is they were spending months, sometimes developing these features, really complex features, putting all this work into it. They get to the end of it, go to the readout, and it would be really conflicting or inconclusive, and then they're left really frustrated, and also with like this really big sunk cost fallacy of all the effort they'd already put into. So that was where the anchor started to be felt for us.
Something that I've seen in the narrative generally with teams that are operating at a high scale is they come to the conclusion that maybe the platform is the problem. And at Chameleon, obviously, we're a platform. We talk about this a lot. We're more AI focused, I think, than others. But how does the tool rationalize some of that thinking? Like, what does the platform? What role does the platform play when you're running into that kind of scenario?
Yeah, so for us at least, and I would imagine for Chameleon, you're working with a pretty mature product, and what's going to happen is that that product is always going to keep maturing. There's always going to be edges to round out. There's going to be new features, and most importantly, new data as well. And that's something that kind of came up in our pilot as well, was exploring some new data. But the point is that if you're working with a company that's growing, the business requirements are going to keep evolving, and so that's part of what we were feeling there is that we were never going to get to perfect, but people wanted that. And they were using that as a justifications and even saying, well, hey, maybe we don't need to experiment or we shouldn't experiment until this thing is perfect. And uh, my counter to that was actually, hey, look, for about 70 to 80% of our use cases, the platform was pretty much complete and ready to go. And really, instead of it being a platform challenge, my hypothesis was that it was really a people and process challenge in how we do it. And the thing is that's really uncomfortable for the organization to hear because when it's a platform feature, we can file that in the backlog and come back to it when we're ready, or hopefully soon. But what's a people problem? One, it kind of feels like an indictment, like somebody's done something wrong, but it's also not something that can just be solved as straightforward as developing some code and pushing it out.
I feel like we could have an entirely separate episode about that exact statement. you know, like it's really tough. It's really easy for teams to change their platform or whatever it is. And it's a lot harder for people to change their teams. But I think something that we do a lot as experimenters is, it's almost funny. I feel like we don't let perfect be the enemy of good when you're doing really well, but at the same time, are we striving for perfect, like through experimentation? I think some people think we are, and that's really challenging. So I'm like really loving this exact answer from you, and I want to just like underline and bold it, because when you are on the search for perfect, I feel like that creates a culture that you're not able to make the shifts on the people side that you need to, because that's not saying you need new people, it's just saying you need new culture. And culture of experimentation is kind of like my big talking point. I always say the biggest threat to experimentation is not doing it at all. And that feels like something that happens with teams when they're observing, like, oh, the platform's right, the platform's good, we can't figure it out, we don't know why. It's tough. But I'm curious, you've spent a ton of time observing, would you say hundreds or thousands of tests? I'm not sure.
Thousands,
Thousands. Yeah, I was like,
mountains.
mountains of tests. Is there any particular pattern or trait of failure that you saw when it comes to individual tests and testing programs at large? I'm curious to get your takes, like on the micro and macro level, any patterns you might have seen or traits that you regularly see in those instances.
Yeah, so like at the more micro level, but what kept repeating itself on the test was kind of three core areas. And one of those was the scope of the change. Like I said earlier, we would see these tests and this development work that had gone on for months. And not only had they spent a long time on that, there's a lot of complexity in that change. They changed a lot, or they built out a lot of things. And so when you're trying to understand what moved, what we'll find out in a minute, are these metrics that are really far away as well. And you change 5, 10, or 15 things all at once. Some of those things might be pushing your goal up, some might be pushing it down. But it's really hard to tell what's going on, and it's really hard to untangle that and understand what really happened. The second part of it was, like I've alluded to as well, is this came in way too late. So the development was done, all the costs had been sunk, and then it's just really painful to step back. And so that also leads to like a behavior that we call trying to save the test. So then you're just in there digging, doing kind of this post hoc analysis, trying to find anything that'll justify a rollout, maybe because you don't want to go back through that process again, or maybe the thing should have never been developed in the first place. And then the final thing there was the metrics, and there was two parts to that problem. One, the metric list, the metric count had really grown over time. That even though we only supported one primary metric, we allowed for the secondary metrics and also informational. And that secondary metric list had grown in a lot of cases like to 10 to 15 metrics, and they're all kind of checkered and overlapping and stuff like that. And the other challenge, mostly with the primary metric, was that oftentimes they pick a really insensitive one. And the reason for that is that the insensitive one usually tied to their org goals. And so this is like the big thing, that they're trying to move. And so they felt like every single experiment that ran had to prove that it moved the big thing. But that wasn't really going to be achievable in a lot of cases, especially for teams that were way up funnel from where these financial goals were happening.
I think I want to attach onto the like, teams way up funnel from where the financial goals are happening, because that sounds like, a large decentralized program. You and I have talked about this previously, that culture can drift when your program is too decentralized. Can you talk about that? Is it inevitable? Is it preventable? What kind of things are you looking out for when you're seeing a team that is like really, really large and trying to tackle a problem maybe they're really far away from?
Yeah, so the challenge is like the decentralized org is that decentralization, and what it kind of lapsed over time was that kind of central connective tissue that would have pulled them all back together. And so what was happening is that as the org and through leadership changes and these financial goals, without that central thing to bring everybody back together, like you said, it was just drifting along, and kind of everybody had forgot why we were there. And so that was part of the drift that happened. What we were working on for that, we had tried different iterations of ideas like champions and heroes and informal groups. And that stuff's really challenging because a lot of times uh, those are kind of like informal roles. Those are things that may not show up on your performance review. So it's really tough to get people interested, even if they really enjoy experimentation and want to learn more. They're annual review says they need to go to all these goals. And so where are they going to choose, like, joining the experimentation group or driving their product goals? So they're always going to pick the product goals.
And there's one other thing you've mentioned before that I want to make sure we don't lose sight of. I think that's a really I love that point. That's like they're always going to choose the product goals, which is something that I've talked a lot about on this show actually, where people are like, okay, well, why would we test if our KPI, our OKR is to ship more features? Like if I'm testing out of features, why would I do that? Right. So like that's a really interesting piece. And I feel like we'll go back to metrics. There's a whole section here that I know you and I have discussed where we want to talk about metrics. But before we get into that, something that you've mentioned is that experimentation for learning has been abandoned, right? Are you seeing experimentation more on the validation exercise side for decisions that are kind of already made? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's kind of the trap that we had fallen into, is that there was these financial goals that had been set. The teams were measuring themselves against, both as a individual, a team, an org, and they're all trying to row towards that goal rather. And so there's a lot of pressure. And how that had kind of drifted was that every experiment had to be towards that and not for learning. And so that led to a bunch of these really bad behaviors. And so they would run these tests. They would try to test the financial goals. And at the end, they weren't getting a clear answer on that. Or what was worse, and kind of the whole anchor part of it, was that to even try to get your metric be powered enough to even try to get that reading, which could still be inconclusive at the end of it, you're having to run this test a really long time. And so what was happening is we weren't learning much, and people, like you said, they were using it for a validation check. It's the final thing. It's the thing we have to do before we go live, and that's all. But there's also all these assumptions being made about how these metrics would correlate and work with each other, and how maybe even what the core purpose of a feature or like a part of the experience is for. And that's what we really started challenging in this pilot as well. Is what if the purpose of this feature is not always to progress people? Because we tend to think about the user experience in this very clean linear path. They start at the upper funnel, land on the homepage, they do a search, they land on a PDP or a product page, and then hopefully they book or check out and book. And the reality is it's very messy, and people do loop, and that's part of their So it's like, what if a feature doesn't always progress a user? What if it's actually makes them happier if you show them they're in the wrong place and get them regressed faster? Things like that.
So we were talking about the kind of tactical experience you had when you worked with a team through the really uncomfortable task of like redesigning their approach from the ground up. They've blown everything up. They're going from 15 key metrics to more like 3. What are some of the things that you experienced in that tactical change?
Right. And so, yeah, the first thing we did in this pilot, I needed to find a team that was willing to work with me. And I approached this team. I threw out my sales pitch, and I got like halfway through it, and they were bought in and ready to go. And I was like, wow, this is great. And so then I really had to get to work from there. And what we did, I asked the product manager, she shared like her overall strategy and her research and the recent experiments that had been running. That led us to kind of breaking down 3 work streams, which I'll kind of cover 2 today in high level detail. But then what we did from there is I set out working with this product manager and her analyst. So we're just a real tight team of 3 working on this effort. And so I took all the stuff that she had shared with me, and I generated myself the experimentation strategy for this first experiment stream that they're going to be running. And that was a really hard process. And I thought, honestly, it was going to be a little bit easier. And it took me about an hour to really get through this thing and really think through it. And the problem was, even though I saw the problem, or I thought I saw the problem from a distance, getting there, getting my hands dirty myself, you learn that you've been influenced by the org, and it gets really tough to like pull apart. Like you said, there's these 10 or 15 metrics. How are you going to get down to 3? It's really uncomfortable to pull those out. We always see these, they're always there. And so that was kind of the first step of it. And so from there, we got together with the team, the analyst, product manager. We went through a refinement process. They had a ton of questions, which are great. They also didn't fully understand all the features on the platform, which is another great learning experience, kind of learning where there were some gaps there, things like that. And so we whittled it down, and then we're able to launch our first test out of that and had some good learnings from it.
Something that practitioners are going to find really valuable out of this episode is that your test cycles, they dropped from like 6 weeks to 2 weeks, right? Like it's the time savings that I think people are going to be really inspired by. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you think was the primary driver for that? What, just for somebody who's listening and saying, I want to drop my cycles from 6 weeks to 2 weeks, right? What are some of the tangible outcomes there?
Yeah, so it was all the things we talked about before. We reduced the first, we got the change in the experiment in way sooner, and we were willing to accept that the feature work wasn't perfect yet, but there was an opportunity just to go ahead and take something and try it out. We also accepted that the metrics weren't fully instrumented the way that we wanted. We, in doing all that discovery work, we discovered new metrics that didn't exist. And actually, what happened, because we were moving fast, we went ahead and launched it. The test failed because there's within a couple of days, because the metrics, not the experience, not a bug, they failed. And that was actually really helpful, because if we had just waited to the end and tried to do this stuff anyways, then it was going to fail anyways, and we would have just had more time lost. But so by reducing the metrics, it came back really crystal clear what was happening, and we moved the key metric way closer to the actual change. We didn't have all these conflicting metrics. Some of those we kind of kept around. By the way, we moved some of those down in our informational, and I kind of challenged them, like, look, we can keep them in the readout. We just don't want to make a decision on them. And what we started learning as well, not only did we have this 6 week to 2 week reduction, we also saw that some of these things that they were really convinced were going to be highly correlated to the change showed none at all, like super, like p-value close to one type situation. And so there were actually some good side learnings in there as well. And so the key takeaways, there were less metrics to try to interpret, so we didn't have this whole checkerboard of results come back, and they were super sensitive as well, so we didn't have to wait weeks to get enough power to get that reading. We had a really strong reading actually within several days, and that actually opened up for us as well the opportunity that, hey, maybe we could adjust our playbook for some of these and not even need a minimum 2 week runtime.
That piece of the metric being closer to the test change being made, when I was a baby doing crow, when I was just a crow baby, I had a really hard time talking to decision makers who are like, well, we're making decisions based on actual dollars here. I don't really care if the navigation change increased navigation clicks, like as long as it's increasing dollars. And I'm like, but there's so many steps between that and this, right? Like, I just think that that's really important, and it really perfectly tees up my next question here, which is for the teams who are measuring those downstream financial goals, right? Because that they take weeks to move. That's obviously the thing that's going to make the higher up decision makers most passionate about a decision. How do you convince a team to trust, a metric closer to the actual change that you made? What does that trust building look like? For me, it was something that took many, many years to master. And I'm curious, because you've done so much work breaking it down and building it back up. How do you build that trust when money moves?
Right. Yeah. So there's like three or four things to unpack in there. One of them is part of the work and why we say we're feature complete. We had implemented circuit breaker and these metrics that would happen, the canary metrics when the test would launch. So we're protecting the core experience there to make sure there's not a large degradation. We'd also implemented guardrail metrics for the end of the experiment, and a lot of those were based around these key financial goals. So we have the protections there in place to protect them. So one, there is automatic protections built in and automatically being calculated and all that stuff as well. And the second part of it then was that not everything needs to move the financial goal today. And you can work through that in a couple of ways. One way you can work through it is you can work with an analyst to have them develop a really in-depth uh, proxy metric. And proxy metric is the word. Have them develop that, and then they can prove that there's a correlation there. So they can say, hey, look, when this thing that's up funnel moves, we've proven that there's a correlation to this thing at the end of funnel that moves. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it as well, and was advocating, is look, just collect these learnings that we're talking about, and so run a bunch of these short tests. And if you really need that reading on that financial goal, collect all your learnings, make your tweaks, blah, 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 and then run one big experiment at the end and prove that you are going to move the financial goal, if that's really where you have to be. But I don't think that's really necessary in a lot of cases. I think like a true proxy metric can just get the job done.
And this question we hadn't talked about previously, but it's something that I really want to make sure is covered in this conversation, which is AI, right? Like everyone is looking for the AI in this conversation, the AI in everything. What is the role of AI in decentralizing culture and like maintaining health towards the you did a lot of work breaking this down and building this back up. I don't think AI could do that. But like is there a role for AI to help create that sustainability long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI mixed with traditional logic and metrics together can do that. I think you can instrument dashboards. I think you can add insights. You could take the learnings that came out of this and my hypothesis and train an AI to look for those types of things. I think you could create a health dashboard, and that was kind of one of the things we were working on to help bring this thing back in. So you can create a health dashboard, you can start adding insights to that, you can even go further than that as well. And some of these metrics that may not seem, and not just like these very granular metrics, some of these big metrics that kind of describe how the users move through the big points in the funnels, stuff like that, you can start to show how these things correlate, and it'll help people not only understand how their individual tests and experiments are moving things, but they can understand how this larger body of work that some of it may be coming from their team or org is doing, but also a lot of times there's work within the sister teams and stuff all around that that are also moving it. It's also very unclear. So I think you can use the AI to start and the and analytics and stuff it can do to help start recognizing those connections as well.
Gotta ask the AI question. It's everyone will be looking for that. I mean, we're coming up on the end of our time here, and I want to make sure I ask my favorite question, which is on I call it the Monday morning advice, right? But somebody could be listening to this on a Wednesday. I understand that. But if somebody's listening on a Sunday and they're saying, my program feels gated, like I'm trying to figure out a way to make it not feel like an anchor. You've successfully done this. What's the first thing they're doing tomorrow after listening to this episode?
Yeah, I mean, the first step is the classic: find a beachhead. Don't try to boil the ocean. So find somebody that's willing to, that is bought in, that's feeling that pain, acutely. Sit down with them, learn what they're working on, and then really, bring this alternate plan to them and focus on things like don't test too much at once, reduce the number of metrics, increase the metric sensitivity, uh, just work through that and work through it together. And then from there, if you can get through it like we did and show the change and show the outcomes, then we kind of went on a promotional tour. We had our monthly newsletter. We had basically a whole piece written by that product manager from her point of view on how everything went. We opened up a Slack channel. We opened up office hours. I made a full blown training out of it, and then starting to roll that out to another. I ran a version of that, and then with one team, and then from there we were looking at institutionalizing that within our like full blown learning and development, so that I wasn't in the loop anymore on it. So that's kind of the gist of it. Simplify things, find a beachhead, win it, and then use that to build momentum to roll it out further.
I'm calling this episode Don't Boil the Ocean. That's perfect advice though. I think a lot of people see, and myself included, right? They see the potential and it's like, "Oh my god, there's literally 50 ways I could start, but I could start with simplifying my metrics." Like you do a very good job of saying like, "Okay, simplify your metrics. Okay, next, how are you democratizing insights? Next." Like I feel like you do a very good job of breaking that out into bite-sized pieces. So I hope we can talk about this another time too. I think we could part two in a year of what I want the update on all things Paul. But okay, I think with that, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate you.
Cool. Thank you very much.
And we'll see you next time.